Bill Maher is facing backlash online for a segment he did on the growing rate of self-identifying LGBTQ people in the country, including children who identify as trans. Let's watch.
Broken down over time, the LGBT population of America seems to be roughly doubling every generation. According to a recent Gallup poll, less than 1% of Americans born before 1946, that's Joe Biden's generation, identify that way. 2.6% of boomers do, 4.2% of Gen X, 10.5% of millennials, and 20.8% of Gen Z. Which means if we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054. And it's okay to ask questions about something that's very new and involves children. The answer can't always be that anyone from a marginalized community is automatically right, trump card, mic drop, end of discussion. Because we're literally experimenting on children. Maybe that's why Sweden and Finland have stopped giving puberty blockers to kids. Because we just don't know much about the long-term effects.
Perhaps the most controversial part of what Maher had to say was when he suggested a, quote, trendy element to identifying as transgender.
If we can't admit that in certain enclaves there is some level of trendiness to the idea of being anything other than straight, then this is not a serious science-based discussion. It's a blow being struck in the culture wars using children as cannon fodder. I don't understand parents who won't let their 9-year-old walk to the corner without a helmet, an EpiPen, and a GPS tracker. And God forbid their lips touch dairy, but... But hormone blockers and genital surgery, fine.
Maher later tweeted, quote, if this spike in trans children is all biological, why is it regional? Either Ohio is shaming them or California is creating them.
To which former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner hit back, quote, trans children in Ohio are constantly under attack from our state and local government. Trans people are everywhere. Governments are regional.
And that's a fair point. And in fact, the thing he tweeted was probably, I thought, the least well thought out part of the entire monologue, because yes, people will come out, are more likely to do so in areas where the policies or the people, the culture are more friendly.
Why are people buying more sunscreen in California than they are in Alaska? It's crazy.
Absolutely. Fair on that point. Fair, that was a fair rebuttal. But most of the monologue I thought was quite good. The point we just did play about, parents won't let their kids make any choices all because of safety on all sorts of front. That way too controlling, I think, in terms of like walking. Parents won't let their kids walk. The law sometimes doesn't let you let your kids play at the playground by themselves or walk to school by themselves. And yet we're deciding that that very invasive medical procedures for young children without, like, no questions asked should be performed. And don't mistake me, I think transgender people are real. I think a lot of people, many children even, probably do suffer from gender dysphoria, and I'm sure treatment is a good option, maybe invasive treatment for some cases. Absolutely, they should talk to doctors about it, therapists, if you think your child is in this scenario. Yeah, so not at all saying this should be outlawed or shouldn't be done, but it does seem that the activists on transgender issues, from my interactions with them on social media, from the thing, there's an automatic affirmation of anyone who expresses any, even very young kids, any discomfort at all about their sex or their gender, and there's a kind of, well, this is the answer for you, and this is what you should do, that there's no way it fits in even a majority of these cases.
So I think the first pushback that people would give is that the idea that parents are very concerned about the risks and health risks that their children are facing, the joke about dairy, which I think is a rather inopportune joke, a week after recovering, that babies are drinking or have a formula deficit and who drink dairy milk are, throwing up blood and all these sorts of things. But never mind. The point is that there are actual health consequences that result from not engaging in certain kind of treatments as well. And the very parent who's very concerned about their kid consuming dairy or being unsafe in the world it's consistent with that concern to not want them to be risking suicidal ideation and all the other things that often come with not responding to a kid with dysmorphia who believes they were born in the wrong body in the right way. I also think that Bill Maher does this thing where he pretends as though hormone therapy or gender blockers or surgery. First of all, he conflates all of these interventions, some of which are indicated at earlier ages than others, many of which the most involved of which don't come until later in life. He conflates them all to drive a panic about what is going on with a 9-year-old. A 9-year-old is what he brings up in this example, as though a 9-year-old is getting top surgery, as though a 9-year-old has a top. So I think all of that is frustrating, and also the erasure of the risks attendant to not giving kids the kind of treatments they need. I also think that he really downplays all of the psychological evaluations and the difficult hurdles that exist for kids to take advantage of those kinds of interventions. And finally, I think the reason why we can't have these conversations in a reasonable way, and I think there are reasonable concerns that parents have and that folks are raising, is because people like Bill Maher are the least equipped to have the conversation and are such alarmists. He uses a chart about growing identification as LGBT to attack people coming out increasingly as trans as trendy. I mean, it's a chart of people identifying as LGBTQIA. That's a lot of people in there who are identifying as bi or fluid or asexual and things like that. And it is really frustrating that it seems like the T in that series of letters is constantly the kind of the punching bag for folks like Maher, who seem to anticipate and understand that there's not as much of a cultural appetite for beating up on gay people anymore. Everybody knows a gay person. It seems inopportune.
Well, I don't think that's fair. I think that
now there's never any. I'm sorry. Like, it seems odd to me that there's never a trans person involved in any of these conversations. Just have someone. Let's just talk it out. Let's just talk it out. But it's always this kind of very one-sided, oftentimes disingenuous conversation that prevents people who might be open to legitimate critique of having that conversation.
I have yet to find the activists on this issue don't want to have conversations about it. In fact, they scream at me that the questions I have about it are examples of legitimating violence against them or something of that nature all the time. The most unfriendly and hostile, shrieking illiberal voices in the entire progressive movement are people obsessed with this issue.
Well, I do think that there has been. I have had difficulty, sourcing people to come on the show and have a conversation about it, because there is a presumption that anyone engaged in the conversation is seeking any kind of nuanced addressing of the issues is acting in bad faith. I think that's true. I also don't think interlocutors like Bill Maher are helping in that regard when the conversations are being driven in contexts like this, or contexts like comedy shows, Dave Chappelle shows and stuff like that, where there is some question, I think, from people who legitimately feel under attack and legitimately feel like there's a lot of difficulty and hurdle to actually coming out as transgender and getting the kind of medical care that they like. That being erased from the conversation makes them, I think, more hostile and less likely to want to engage in a public sphere.
We're focusing on this, and this is a legitimate public policy question because it involves kids and it involves medical procedures that are so the puberty blockers are right to delay puberty so that you get the surgeries later. But we don't know. There's reporting on the puberty blockers are not entirely necessarily consequence free. My friend Jesse Singal has done a lot of reporting on this. A lot of reporting that really ticked off the transgender activist community. Katie Herzog has done a lot of reporting on people who did transition, who had this procedure recommended to them based on their supposed discomfort in their own bodies, only to later want to go back and it was not right for them. And you're not supposed to even talk about those cases, which are numerous.
I certainly think that you should be allowed to talk about those cases, but it's also the case, and Jesse Singal, I think, was rightly very careful to make this point in his much maligned Atlantic article from a few years back, that those cases are very, very rare, and detransitioners are in the very small minority of people who ever transition. And again, this is the risk. The risk is that by talking about detransitioners who deserve to be heard, and that deserves to be a part of the public record, you are skewing people's perception of what the risks are against the risks of not allowing kids to transition.
That's true of people who go through with the transition, but there are a large number of people, of kids diagnosed with gender dysphoria, but then never actually end up going through with the transition, and then later do no longer identify as having gender dysphoria. So all of those had gone.
What's the harm in saying, okay, it seems like you're presenting with gender dysphoria. It sounds like the medical recommendation there is just to hold off, or have a psychological intervention, therapy intervention.
No, right. That was the correct course of action.
Right.
But if we had been in a mindset of, oh no, gender dysphoria, okay, let's get everything going, that would have been wrong.
I think there's a misrepresentation of how many people are in that mindset. I'm not saying that there's never a doctor in the whole history of the world that is overzealous. That happens in many cases and in many kinds of medical interventions. But it strikes me as curious, you said it a little while ago, that this is a public health concern because it involves children. That doesn't strike me as especially a libertarian mindset. We're talking about parents in parts of the country that want to teach their kids a certain kind of history, that don't want to talk about what I think are basic facts about American history and the reality of slavery and Jim Crow and all of these kinds of things. Fine, if they want to, teach their kids what they want to teach. In that context, everyone's like, the home is sacred. I want my kid to know what I want to know. Suddenly, when we're talking about very intimate decisions being made between children, their doctors, and their family members, it's a point of national conversation, and I'm not entirely sure why that is.
Okay, it should absolutely be a decision between the child, the family, consultation with the doctor. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I mean, we're talking about it because we're interested in the broader social phenomenon. If there's a contagion aspect to it, I'm not saying it should be banned or prohibited.
Aspect to it. So let's talk about that.
Contagion.
Yeah. So I do think. I mean, this is the point about California versus Ohio. Of course, it's going to be the case when people feel like it's more socially acceptable to take a certain course of action, that they're going to take the certain course of action. I think there's the same number of gay people born in Ohio as California, the same number of trans people proportionally. But of course, in a more welcoming environment, you're going to feel more able to come out. Now, is there some risk that people, especially kids who are going through puberty, which is not a fun time, and who are oftentimes feeling very ambivalent about their gender, as a girl, your growing parts of men are looking at you in ways that make you feel very uncomfortable? Is that perhaps going to make you think, I could identify as male in a world where that's an option to you, even though 40 years ago, you might not have thought that, and even though 10 years from now, you might not see yourself that way, it was just circumstantial? Quite possibly. But that is why I think it's important to have psychological evaluations and measure doctors who, I want to see Bill Maher talking about the evidence that that's not the case. Tell me some specific examples of doctors that have been overzealous, and let's talk about, what should be done about those human beings, not attacking the broader social phenomenon.
But to do those evaluations, you have to push back a little bit. You have to make sure that the child is not just feeling just uncomfortable in their own body, the way all teenagers do at some point. And I really reject this quasi-ideological notion that that if you're uncomfortable in your own skin, or you're not happy with the way you look, it must be because you're born in the wrong. That's not.
I would argue that that is not the case. I certainly don't think that every teenager who's uncomfortable in their own skin, the psychologists who are tasked with doing these intensive evaluations of folks to decide whether or not, I think there is this perception, and some of it is, I think, the broader culture's fault. I think there's a flippant way that people can talk about these issues. There's a flippant way that it can happen in the pop culture space that I think is really attenuated from what's happening in these clinical environments, when all parents, no matter how woke you are, I think are hesitant about doing any kind of intervention with their kid that could have permanent consequences when the kid is so young and their decision-making faculties are so underdeveloped. I don't know a parent in the world, no matter how woke, no matter how progressive, no matter how liberal they are, that doesn't pause and take this kind of decision very seriously. And that's what's so frustrating. I think there's a broad agreement on these issues. I think parents are all broadly concerned that they want to do the right thing. And us having this conversation, I don't think is especially informed, is nowhere near as informed as the intensive psychological process that folks have to go through with doctors, with therapists, to get to the point where they would actually have. And that's good, but
I see it in the training materials, in sort of activist. The way gender and the ones that activist educators share at conferences about, here's how you talk about these issues, conflating sex and they're conflating the gingerbread gender thing. Have you seen that?
No, we're going to different conferences.
It's the gingerbread gender bread thing. I'm not making this up. That's too specific for me to have made that up on the spot.
I believe you, but nothing's translated for me. It's making me hungry.
And also, There's a conflation now with sex and gender that the right used to really make, that now I feel like this is an activist progressives making, that like you can be, I don't believe there's anything like innately biological about, you can't tell me that like if a little boy likes to play with dolls, that necessarily means they're a girl. They just might be a feminine boy, they might be gay, they might just like dolls. That doesn't mean we should recommend puberty blockers to this person. And in the training materials, they bring that up always. But that's gender. That's a different thing.
So this is an argument that's made by some folks who are characterized as traditional feminists, some folks that are characterized as TERFs.
Yes.
Who say it used to be the case that if you had not, interests or proclivities that were different from what is stereotypical to your sex,
right,
then you should have the freedom to be whoever you want to be, not change your sex to align with...
Not be asserted into a different category. We're trying to erode these categories entirely because we're all individuals.
Yeah, there's a kind of essentialism that can come out.
And that's sort of where as a libertarian I get animated, because everyone is an individual, not part of some broad collective or categorization, and people should feel encouraged and free to associate with whatever traits they like, and it doesn't mean you have to slot yourself with some entirely other thing.
But this is why I think it's so important to get like psychologists in this conversation. And to Jesse Singal's credit, he did talk to a lot of people who were very authoritative on the subject when he wrote his articles, including people who said, yes, I've experienced people who detransition, but I still ultimately feel like this is the best course of action for most people, because there is a big difference. And people who are clinically able to assess are overwhelmingly successful in assessing the difference between a tomboy or a girl who ultimately realizes she's lesbian, and a person who was assigned gender female at birth, who ultimately realizes that they're male. And you and I might be confounded, and the genderbread people might be confounded by these kind of distinctions, but I would caution folks against thinking that the level of confusion and mistakes that are happening are as high as people like Bill Maher represent them with their exponential graphs and such on their show.
I think they're very high in the way these things are talked about by progressive activists and educators and the people like you see on TikTok. Maybe it's not the case with the actual doctors and medical establishment. That I would grant.
Yeah, well, let's get some doctors in the room.
Let's get some gingerbread cookies in here first.
Well,
I'm starving.
Next up, we will be talking about the fact that former Vice President Mike Pence is allegedly eyeing a bid for president in 2024. We'll discuss that next with our panel. Please do stick around.